Hey, welcome to Crossroads. In today's episode, I'll be giving an update first on the attempt to remove Donald Trump from the 2024 ballot. Also, right now, Iran, including its proxies, are threatening the Mediterranean Sea. They're attacking shipping channels. There's a lot going on with this, and I'll explain the broader context of that with the CCP strategy of the string of pearls. A lot going on, pretty important stuff. First off, though, right now, the main Secretary of State is now trying to remove Donald Trump from the 2024 ballot. And people are questioning, well, does the Secretary of State actually have the authority to do that? It's actually debatable based on previous Supreme Court rulings. We've seen that, for example, election decisions are not limited to the state legislature, not limited to the governor, not limited to the Secretary of State. That needs to be kind of a process between all of them, and so it's questionable whether this is going to hold up. The challenge to the 2024 ballot from the main Secretary of State is being challenged by Republicans and by the Trump campaign. Regardless, though, it seems the goal of this is to push it into court, and it's very likely going to head into court now. It's possible the case will not result in a decision on the 14th Amendment. That's going to be the big question here with the broader implications for the whole country. The case in Maine could just go into limits, for example, on legal powers of a Secretary of State. And so, again, we'll see how this goes. The big context of this, though, is the Colorado case where the Colorado Supreme Court did, in fact, rule to remove Donald Trump from the ballots. Republicans, as an update on this, they issued a formal request to the Supreme Court to take up the case, and the attempt in Colorado, because of that, is now on hold, and we're going to wait and see now whether there's going to be a decision from the Supreme Court. You know, we're just coming out of the holiday season. Supreme Court, despite how big this is, they did not really confirm or say much during the time. And so, we're coming into the week now, beginning all this, and we might be able to get a word from the Supreme Court now on, how they're going to be moving forward with it. As things currently stand, the move to remove Trump from the ballot in Colorado and in Maine, it's kind of still going on, but we're waiting now for the Supreme Court decision. And depending on what the Supreme Court says, whether they ruled it's legal or illegal, that is going to set the decision for the entire country. If the Supreme Court determines that, hey, yeah, Colorado can remove Trump from the ballot, you're very likely going to see that replicated throughout the entire country, or at least a lot of it. And if they rule that no, they cannot remove Trump from the ballot, you're going to see that likely ripple as well. And the attempt on this front is going to come to a pretty swift end. Now, that said, of course, we can go into this more later. But something else big is happening right now. Iran is threatening to close the Mediterranean Sea. And this is bigger than just the Mediterranean. This is bigger than just even Iran. This ties into a much broader conflict when it comes to trade war, international shipping, and maritime sovereignty. This ties into, I'd say, a broader economic war taking place mainly between the US and China. And Iran is acting like a proxy within this, and of course the Houthis as well. Now, as conflicts with Russia, Iran, and potentially China right now are increasing, there's now an effort on who's going to control the international shipping channels. The emerging threat relates to the so-called string of pearls of the Chinese Communist Party. I'll get into that. The CCP has been trying to gain a foothold in all the major global shipping choke points. Everywhere where you have a shipping choke point, the CCP is trying to gain control of the ports, and it's also building military bases. You see this, for example, in Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. You see it, for example, in the Panama Canal, including in the new canals the CCP is building. You see it, for example, in all the other major areas, including around Taiwan. If the CCP gains control of that means control of international shipping. Control of international shipping means control of the international economy. And as global conflicts grow, so grows the risk of these channels being cut off. Because a country, if you control these channels, you can determine who gets through and who does not. And if a country is not able to get through international shipping channels, that means global economics, the global supply chains, belong to one country or another. Now, we've lived under a very unique time in history with the United States having the Pax Americana, where America has become the de facto, world government, essentially, even whether we like that position or not. And America has maintained a standard where we don't charge people, we provide international security, we secure international shipping lanes, we don't deny people access to it, we don't deny countries access to it. And for the most part, America does this as just almost like a global service. That has never been the norm for the world. And if the CCP is able to gain control of it, it's very likely that that norm that America has established will come to an end. We see now that Iran is threatening these channels and trying to shut them off. And that's one of the big concerns of what the future holds if this is allowed to stand. Let me show you this first. This is The Hill. It says Iran threatened Saturday that the Mediterranean Sea could be closed if the U.S. and Israel continue crimes in Gaza, according to state media, according to Reuters. And they say this is according to state media in Iran. They're quoting an Iranian brigadier general. It says this: they shall soon await the closure of the Mediterranean Sea, the Strait of Gibraltar, and other waterways. And we've, of course, seen some examples of them doing this where you have these, Houthi fighters, terrorist groups, launching attacks on shipping containers. Ships bring these shipping containers. They even managed to sink one ship. You have the U.S. trying to tell these ships, keep going through, don't stop. A lot of international shippers, businesses that run these supply chains, they're avoiding certain areas right now. And if America is not able to provide proper security, that means a shipping channel has now been denied. Now, keep in mind that denying a shipping channel is not just, for example, shutting it down completely, which Iran is threatening to do and which these Houthi fighters are saying they will do. It also ties into the perception of security. If you're a private business and you risk, for example, losing an entire ship, whether it's through piracy or whether it's through terrorists or whether it's through the actions of an entire nation, in this case, Iran, are you willing to risk it? And do you believe that security will be provided, as the U.S. is saying it will provide it? Well, again, that's going to be you putting your neck on the line on the credibility of the United States and its international security systems. America has since actually shot at and killed several of these Houthi fighters while defending these ships, and this could very likely escalate as well into a broader terror war with, ironically, the targets of the terrorists being these shipping channels. It's unclear right now, according to this report, how Iran is going to follow through on this threat where it says it's going to shut down, the Mediterranean Sea. This is as the country has no direct access to the Mediterranean Sea and no major naval presence outside the Persian Gulf. Very likely what we're seeing, though, is that Iran is going to use proxy forces like the Houthis to do its work for it. Now, briefly, do you remember under Barack Obama, after Obama ironically gave pallets of cash, literal pallets of money to Iran? Do you remember that? And Iran immediately began capturing U.S. troops, showing propaganda videos of U.S. sailors being held at gunpoint. That was Iran's way of saying, thank you, Obama, after Obama gave them literal pallets of straight cash. Do you remember that? Well, here's a reminder of that from the end of the Obama administration. This was Reuters back in 2016. And Reuters in 2016 said just 2 days after the United States and other world powers lifted sanctions on Iran, the military released its most comprehensive timeline to date of the events surrounding the sailors' brief detainment. It says the U.S. sailors who were aboard 2 patrol craft were detained by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps on January 12th when they inadvertently entered Iranian territorial waters. They were released the next day after being held for about 15 hours. Iran took U.S. sailors, members of the U.S. military, hostage briefly. And, well, it looks like Iran is now back on this same game. Biden, following in the footsteps of Barack Obama, frees up billions of dollars for Iran, and lo and behold, what happens immediately? Iran, the world's largest sponsor of terrorism, immediately begins re-sponsoring global terrorism. What a surprise, right? And it looks like Iran is back to its old game. We've seen them do this before, they're doing it again, and they're doing it publicly. And right now they're saying publicly that they're going to start targeting international shipping channels. I'll get into a bit on why this is really important and what this means as well for Russia and China. Now, right now, global shipping channels are very much in danger. A chemical tanker, according to BBC, in the Indian Ocean was hit by a drone that was launched from Iran just recently. BBC says that a fire on board the Chem Pluto was extinguished. There were no casualties. Iran has not commented. Houthi rebels in Yemen, who are backed by Iran and support Hamas in its war with Israel, have recently used drones and rockets to target vessels in the Red Sea. Again, we were saying, how is Iran threatening the Mediterranean? How is Iran threatening areas where it has no military or naval presence? Well, maybe again they're using the Houthi rebels as their proxy force. But BBC says this event is the first of its kind so far away from there, according to Maritime Security in Ambri. It says the same company also said the vessel was heading from Saudi Arabia to India and was linked to Israel. The Houthis have claimed to be targeting Israel-linked vessels over the conflict in Gaza. And actually, as it currently stands, a lot of these ships are avoiding the ports in Israel because of this, because they don't want to get attacked by Iranian proxy forces. Now, remember a few key things. Whoever controls shipping choke points controls maritime trade. This has been the lesson for the entire world, going back to the time of the Spanish Armada and, of course, in the rise of global maritime trade. This has been the standard the world has lived under in terms of global economics. Whoever controls the shipping choke points controls maritime trade. And whoever controls maritime trade, guess what? They control the global economy. And of course, there's a big battle going on right now over who is going to control the global economy. The Chinese Communist Party is vying for this over this with the United States. And one of the big strategies the CCP has had, again, we mentioned briefly, is what they call the string of pearls. What is the string of pearls? There are many different global shipping choke points, areas where ships have to, cross through in order to maintain the standards of global trade. China, the Chinese Communist Party, has been trying to gain control over these shipping choke points. Who controls access? Who can deny access? Again, of course, they've gained control of the Panama Canal. They've gained control over the Horn of Africa. They've gained control over many different areas, South China Sea, and so on. This has included not only port deals and, of course, using the Belt and Road Initiative to work with local countries to build these ports, which then fall under Chinese control, ironically. Part of the Belt and Road Initiative is the CCP builds the infrastructure and then manages it afterwards and then bills the country that has built it in, oftentimes using predatory loan policies, which the countries can never pay off. And when they default on it, the CCP gains control of even more assets within the country. Now, the other side of that as well is the CCP is also providing the security for these different ports and the security for these shipping channels. Because it needs to provide security, it has to build military bases. And because it has to build military bases at shipping choke points, it needs to maintain, of course, a naval military presence. The CCP, through that, is building up capabilities and infrastructure to control or deny access at all these key shipping choke points. And it is said previously, even publicly, who's to say it should be free? Who's to say you can't charge people for going through it? If they're going to be providing security, Why don't you pay them a toll in order to maintain that? And if they can, of course, be the gatekeepers of this, who's to say they can't deny countries in their entirety? Now, that being said, it's not just China, it's not just Iran on this front. Russia is also doing some of this as well. Russia right now is being accused of using chemical weapons in the Black Sea. Now, it seems Russian forces in the Black Sea are upping the stakes. They're accused, again, of using chemical weapons. And this is a major escalation, not only in the war with Ukraine, but also in terms of the threat Russia is presenting against NATO, against the United States, and in terms of the escalation and the types of weapons that are going to be used. Now, Newsweek said that a Russian Black Sea Fleet Marine Brigade deployed in southern Ukraine is using chemical weapons dropped by drones against Ukrainian fighters, according to Moscow's military. It says Moscow's military appears to have confirmed this. Now, the brigade said this: the tactic of dropping K-51 grenades from drones on enemy positions was successfully tested and applied in order to smoke them out from fortified positions. It confirmed this would be a violation, if confirmed, this would be a violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. This is a treaty that has been in place for more than a quarter of a century, aimed at destroying chemical weapons stockpiles and chemical weapon production facilities, as well as banning their use. Russia, notably, is a party to the convention, suggesting they'll be violating this arms deal. Now, violating arms deals is not necessarily unheard of. We know, for example, that Russia has even talked about using localized nuclear weapon strikes. Now, remember, on the front of chemical weapons, Russia is also accusing Ukrainian troops of using chemical weapons. There have been some videos, for example, showing them dropping these small, chemical bombs onto soldiers using small drones. Many people have seen some of these videos by now. Russia's doing it. Ukraine is doing it. You have drones flying over individual troops, dropping explosive devices into trenches, into their sleeping positions, and so on, and, killing or maiming troops. Both sides are doing it. There were several videos going around that alleged to show Ukrainian troops using chemical bombs. There was one viral video, for example, where a Ukrainian soldier was opening up a refrigerator and showing different chemical canisters. Now, it's hard to tell which side is really honest with this. This is part of the fog of war. We're going to be seeing a lot more of this, of course, as things escalate. It's hard to tell which videos are authentic and which ones are just being faked for propaganda. Russia is known to do this oftentimes. They have, of course, an organization called the Internet Research Agency, and that, of course, produces fake propaganda videos, disinformation, and so on. It is also totally possible that you have renegade Ukrainian troops who are creating basic chemical weapons. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors in war, and it's hard to tell which side is telling the truth. Case in point, who blew up the bridges in Ukraine? The one heading into Crimea. Who blew up the gas pipelines? Both sides blame the other side. There's, again, a lot of smoke and mirrors when it comes to war. And, of course, both sides are going to blame the other side. Both sides are going to deny certain things. But as you have, let's say, normalization of narratives and normalization of the uses of different type of weapons, including chemical weapons, maybe even eventually including localized nuclear strikes, like they are talking about it. You are going to have both sides talking about using new types of munitions. As global conflict increases, notably, the United States is going to have less and less ability to react to things like this. And as the U.S. and its allies fail to react, we can expect to see a slow creep in the use of weapons like this. Again, we've seen smaller examples now of chemical weapons getting used between Ukraine and Russia. And as these weapons are used increasingly, and as we see the U.S. does not condemn it or take action to, let's say, punish one side or the other for using it, you're going to see it becoming more normal for them to start deploying these weapons. Because if Russia's using chemical weapons, Ukraine is going to say, well, we have to match it. If Ukraine is using chemical weapons, Russia is going to say, well, we have to match it. Russia, you might remember, has been saying that the US and its allies are already using forms of nuclear weapons. That's actually kind of a play on words, because the technical reality of it is that certain anti-tank munitions use depleted uranium. It's a type of hardened metal that they will, for example, put on the tips of certain anti-tank munitions in order to make the munitions more able to penetrate armor. It's not nuclear. It's not nuclear materials technically, in terms of the ability to have a type of, let's say, getting people sick through through nuclear, through radioactive sickness or whatever like that. It's not like that. It's again depleted uranium, which is more like a type of metal. But Russia is comparing that to the use of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, of course, when we think of them, we think nuclear bombs, we think Nagasaki, we think Hiroshima. Russia is saying that the West is already deploying nuclear weapons through the use of depleted uranium. And because of that, they're trying to use that as justification for a narrative of using tactical nukes for localized strikes. Now, when we talk about nuclear weapons, we're often talking about, the big ones. We're talking about global nuclear war. We're talking about destroying entire cities using a single bomb. There are actually smaller types of nuclear weapons, tactical nukes. And if Russia, for example, were to use these, well, you'd be looking at localized strikes and then area denial from the radioactivity. Russia is currently talking about using those types of weapons. Now, normally, if a country is threatening to use nuclear weapons, we talk about mutually assured destruction. Going back in time, during the Amur Valley conflict, during the Cold War, when Russia and China were, for example, having actual ground battles, a forgotten part of history, by the way. One of the pieces of history that has since emerged was that Russia actually asked the United States during the Cold War, the Soviet Union, asked the United States for, let's say, a window to be able to use nuclear weapons against the Chinese Communist Party. Russia wanted to nuke China. And of course, the Soviet Union was assuming at the time that America might allow it, because at the time, Russia and China were technically allies in the Cold War against the United States. And if Russia wanted to launch a nuclear attack on an enemy of the United States, the Chinese Communist Party at the time, they assumed that America would allow it. The United States said, no, our standards of mutually assured destruction hold up. Any country uses nuclear weapons, we will meet it in kind and we will destroy you. Because of that, Russia did not use nuclear weapons against China when they were having the Amur Valley conflict and when this whole thing was happening. And of course, that has been the standard maintained. Anybody uses nukes, it's mutually assured destruction, and that works as a way of ensuring that no country ever uses them again. But right now, as Russia's talking about using tactical nukes against Ukraine, America's no longer talking about mutually assured destruction. What they're saying now is they will meet it with sanctions. And if Russia is cut off economically anyways, well, do they really fear sanctions enough to dissuade them from using these types of weapons? Again, what we're watching now is a slow creep, a slow advancement of unconventional munitions that are normally banned and normally very seriously regarded, that are no longer being treated with that level of seriousness. Now, as all of this happens as well, there's also now rumors that Vladimir Putin, the head of Russia right now, is interested in a ceasefire, and that he's risking a palace coup, that he's risking, of course, people within his own system rising up against him, and that the Russian military has been heavily destroyed. The question now is, will Russia go to the negotiating table? Will Russia maybe surrender its interests? It's unclear whether that's going to happen. And if Putin really believes that, for example, the war may be coming to an end and there's no hope in sight of winning will he be willing to, let's say, use weapons that, let's say, up the game? And it's very possible he will. Now, Real Clear Defense says something. They say all this testifies to the fact that Moscow's military recruitment efforts over the past year have done little to reverse the trend of growing manpower deficits on the front. The horizontal recruitment of military personnel from other branches of the armed forces who are not directly participating in the war, together with the recruitment of prisoners and those Russians suffering from poverty and unemployment, have been the main source of the Kremlin's new recruits. It says the understaffing of military units remains a systemic problem for the Russian armed forces. The Kremlin will presumably continue to report inflated statistics in an effort to save face with an increasingly frustrated domestic population. And it says the Russian military leadership has promised to increase the number of contracted soldiers to 745,000 by the end of 2024, up from 695,000 by the end of 2026, as was planned last year. In other words, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors. We don't really know their real numbers. Both sides say that the other is running out of troops. Both sides deny this. And of course, we see even in Ukraine, they're recruiting older and older generations of men to fight in the war. Russia is very likely going to be doing that as well. And of course, Zelensky is also claiming Ukraine is still able to fight a long war. Russia has many more people than Ukraine does, and it looks like Ukraine also, interestingly, is starting to clean things up on the front of corruption. One of the big concerns for the United States, by the way. Let me show you this. Ukraine is starting to expose more corruption in its military ranks, and I'll explain why this matters in a minute. Let me show you first, this is Arca Max. It says Ukraine's defense ministry said it uncovered an attempt by some officials to purchase artillery shells at inflated prices, revelations that came after Defense Ministry Rustem Umerov pledged to weed out corruption in the military sphere. It says one official was detained and others were dismissed from their posts as a result of the investigation, the ministry said in a statement. Briefly on this, one of the reasons why Ukraine is having trouble getting money to finance its war is the perception of corruption. It's personally, for me, one of my biggest concerns. Generally speaking, I believe Ukraine has a right to defend itself against Russia and against Russian invasion. I think personally that Russia presents a much larger threat to the world as it's aligned with the Chinese Communist Party than, the future of like a woke Ukraine working with the West and the United Nations and so on. Personally, I think the idea of national Bolshevism that Russia has come to represent, a combination of communism and fascism, or national socialism, again, national Bolshevism, which is what they call it, the fourth political theory as they call it, I believe that represents a serious threat as Russia begins aligning itself more closely with the Chinese Communist Party. At the same time, though, I believe that American finances going to support Ukraine need to be audited. Otherwise, the money we're giving them isn't going to defend the country in the first place. We need to make sure that if we're giving them money to defend themselves, then that money is actually being used to defend the country, and it's not going into the dirty pockets of corrupt officials to buy themselves yachts and vacation homes and so on, which unfortunately we've seen examples of. I don't believe it's responsible to the people fighting to defend Ukraine if corrupt officials are taking the money and using it for whatever they want. I understand one of the arguments in not having audits is that it's a corrupt country and the officials are the ones keeping the war going, and if they don't have enough bribery coming in, then they don't have an incentive to make sure the war continues. I don't think that's a clean way of doing things, and frankly, I think that's creating a lot of the perceptions of why people don't want to finance the war in the first place and why people don't want to support Ukraine in the first place. Personally, I think that making sure there are audits, making sure that corruption does not happen is an act of respect and, for the Ukrainian troops fighting and dying to defend the country. I don't think these things are in conflict with each other. And so I believe that now that Ukraine is at least showing some signs of weeding out corruption, this is them giving a nod to those concerns from the West, especially as we enter an election season, and especially as we're probably going to see depending on how things go, possibly a return of Donald Trump and someone who is going to, maybe reevaluate whether we're going to finance this war, helping Ukraine defending itself against Russia, if there's no audits and if there's no checks and balances in place. Now, it's interesting to see that Ukraine now is shifting on that a little bit, and they are taking some efforts to make sure that corruption is not taking place. Something else is happening right now, though. Remember, we're talking about the broader context of global war. There's the Russia-Ukraine war. We now see Iran backing different terror organizations. We see Iran-backed Hamas going to war with Israel. We see Iran-backed Houthis launching attacks on maritime, ships and so on, trying to damage international trade. We see the Chinese Communist Party right now saying that it is going to take over Taiwan and there's nobody that's going to stop them. We see Venezuela talking about going to war against different countries as well. We see, for example, in Latin America, the prospect of a very real war. Now, given against, of course, Guyana, which is positioned right now to become a major oil power. Briefly on that, Guyana is to the northeast of the continent of South America. And you see right now Venezuela, a communist-led country, talking about attacking, invading, and possibly seizing control of those oil assets. Recently, of course, Guyana did a discovery of one of the world's largest oil reserves, and it's set to become one of the most wealthy countries on the face of the planet because of that. And as that happens, remember, Lula in Brazil is now in control, and Lula is very far left and very much aligned with the global leftist establishment. It's possible they could even back Venezuela on that. And so take that into account. Venezuela, Iran, Russia, China. We've been talking about on this show for a long time now about the CCP's war doctrines, how it even wanted to use Brazil as a proxy force against the United States, and how they wanted to drag America into 4 separate wars in order to clear the way for the Chinese Communist Party to invade Taiwan. Well, here we are, we have our 4 wars. Now, that being said, there's going to be different types of munitions and different types of unconventional war being employed. We see now attacks on global shipping. Part of that could tie into the CCP's standards of maintaining control and seizing control of global maritime trade and eventually cutting off the United States from the ability to trade internationally. Isolating the United States as part of this global policy. That was one of the big concerns for a long time. We now see it, at least in part, being enacted. The other big thing you're going to be looking at is the denial of certain regions as well. The standard for this is called A2AD, Area Denial Anti-Access. And you're also going to be watching the use of different munitions being employed, including nuclear weapons. We talked briefly about how Russia is already starting to normalize the use of chemical weapons and how they're talking now about using even tactical nuclear weapons. Iran is going to become the next big picture with this. Iran right now has reached a state where it can possibly produce nuclear weapons. It is expanding its nuclear weapons programs, and it has reached a level of nuclear enrichment that is kind of the red line. Remember, briefly, Israel has frequently said that Iran's nuclear enrichment is a red line for it to go to war against Iran. And keep in mind the broader context of this, that a lot of these countries, when they talk about going to war, especially with their U.S. allies, that means America going to war, and they're oftentimes depending on us to defend them from, let's say, being pulled into a war where they're going to be destroyed by all the surrounding countries. Right now, Iran, according to Wall Street Journal, has tripled production of nearly weapons-grade uranium. This is in a move, it says, to likely deepen its confrontation with the West as Tehran helps allied militias to attack Israel and U.S. forces in the region. It says Iran is the only country in the world that is not a declared nuclear power currently producing 60% enriched uranium, which can be converted to weapons-grade materials within days. In other words, the red line, the concern we had of Iran being able to produce nuclear weapons, we're there. It has now happened. Now, Wall Street Journal says U.S. officials have said it would take Iran less than 2 weeks to convert enough 60% material into a form that could be used in a nuclear weapon. It says experts say Iran already has a sufficient stock of highly enriched uranium to fuel 3 weapons. Iran now is able to create nuclear weapons. The time has arrived. And remember as well that Iran is threatening mainly Israel currently, and of course backing different proxy forces in the war against Israel. And Biden, of course, is freeing up money, ironically, for Iran during this time, despite heavy pressure from the members of Congress, especially from Republicans, to not be giving Iran money. Because what is this? We unlock all this money for Iran, and we see the almost immediate reemergence of global terrorism because Iran, and ironically among terrorist groups backed by Iran. And then suddenly Iran is going to develop nuclear weapons. One of the red lines, by the way, in terms of the sanctions we had with them in the first place. They are, of course, pushing the limits of what they can do, and they're seeing whether America is going to react, and America is not showing signs it will react. And they're going to keep pushing that until they find the limit. Will they now create nuclear weapons? They already have the capability, and they can do it within 2 weeks. And Israel has repeatedly said that if Iran does that, they will launch attacks on Iran. Now, you have some U.S. officials right now calling for the United States to wage war on Iran. Lindsey Graham and so on calling for this. It's very possible we could soon get pulled into a real war with Iran as well. And remember, as this continues, Russia's talking about a broader war with NATO. China is now, again, Xi Jinping openly told Biden to his face that China is in fact going to take Taiwan. And as all this happens, well, we're here. America's possibly getting pulled into multiple wars. At the very least, we're financing them. And at the very least, America is getting now pulled into a terror war as it has to defend international shipping channels against Iran-backed terrorists. Now, there's also something else happening, which is as America is helping finance Ukraine and helping finance Israel, we are losing our ability to defend ourselves. America's military arsenal is being depleted. And as the American military is, losing its ability to actually function because we're giving away so much of our military assets and our defense spending to other countries to fight proxy wars, the United States right now is signing into action one of the, let's say, a very large defense bill. Biden has now signed into law the defense bill, which is roughly $86 billion. The Washington Examiner said that President Joe Biden on Friday signed the annual National Defense Authorization Act into law, and that approves $886.3 billion in spending, getting close to $1 trillion there, according to a press release from the White House. And it said this, according to the Commander-in-Chief, Joe Biden, it says the act provides the critical authorities we need to build the military required to deter future conflicts while supporting service members and their spouses and families who carry out that mission every day. It notes as well that a separate $105 billion national security package is also currently being negotiated. Remember, Republicans have been saying they're not going to give money to Ukraine unless the Biden administration actually starts securing our border, something you'd want to do for facing global war, especially with terrorists. And they're not doing, by the way. Democrats are refusing to secure the border. They're refusing to go along with that. And so the bill to help finance Israel and Ukraine and their wars, $105 billion, is currently on hold until that happens. Again, we'll see where it goes, but very likely America is going to be fighting multiple, at this point, proxy wars. And these proxy wars are already well on their way to, let's say, becoming much more serious. We see even the real possibility of nuclear war. Even North Korea right now is talking about the inevitability of war, and they're putting military satellites in place, which, by the way, can be armed, yes, with nuclear weapons as well. And as all this takes place, the U.S. is facing a very real situation that it's burning through its munitions, and we need to very seriously increase our ability to fight wars more directly. Real Clear Defense had something on this. It says that as fighting rages in the Middle East and Europe and China looms as a threat, America's dwindling arsenal of high-end munitions is emerging as an alarming crisis. It says the United States, once a fortress of military might, now faces the prospect of a munitions deficit in an era brimming with uncertainties. This desperate situation demands the development of a national critical munitions stockpile. It says European weapons makers are overwhelmed and struggling to meet Ukraine's consumption of more than 6,000 artillery rounds each day during peak counteroffensive fighting. It says Ukraine's ability to stave off defeat and defend itself against a Russian invasion largely depends on an uninterrupted supply of these rounds. It says Ukrainian forces are conserving their ammunition supply, which might lead to postponement of upcoming counterattacks. Now, given this situation, I'll say this. America currently is in a state where we don't have the munitions or capabilities to really launch a major war, because we've been, again, supplying our defense budget and a lot of our munitions to Ukraine and other areas to fight their wars, or help them fight their wars. This has created a very narrow window of vulnerability. And if America does not rapidly ensure that we're able to fight a full-scale war, that leaves a window of opportunity for other countries to very quickly launch, let's say, a takeover, like, for example, the Chinese Communist Party doing a rapid takeover of Taiwan. And of course, by the time it's done, they could easily say, hey, said and done, what are you going to do about it? And do essentially what they did when it came to the CCP's takeover of Hong Kong, telling the whole world, it's done, it's over, what are you going to do about it? And the world saw, well, the answer to that was relatively nothing. If America does not very quickly start acting again to punish other nations for, let's say, invasion, let's say for using, weapons of war that are banned by treaty, chemical weapons, maybe even nuclear weapons, or even stopping the development and deployment of nuclear weapons, as we see right now, is a very real threat with Iran. Well, we're heading into a very serious, very dangerous situation for the world, and we're not playing with a full deck of cards, let's say, when it comes to America's leadership right now, and so there are some real concerns with that as well. All right, folks, that said, let's jump into some questions. All right. And thank you all for being here. I know I've been out of commission for a bit, and so it's good to be back. Those of you know I was actually out not feeling well for a few days. Let's see here. U.S. citizen on the ground. You're saying, isn't blocking shipping more reason the Americas need to produce their own essential goods, meds, etc.? Yes. Actually, that's something that's been a major point, not just for Joe Biden, but also before him, Donald Trump, and even before him, Barack Obama. There's been a lot of talk around securing supply chains. And that statement actually has a lot of implications. When it comes to securing supply chains, part of that is securing global shipping choke points and making sure that we have access to global shipping channels. We've seen, for example, the Chinese Communist Party trying to launch the A2AD strategy, area denial anti-access, in the South China Sea, telling international shippers and companies running these big boats covered with these shipping containers, telling them that they have to ask permission from China if they want to pass through the South China Sea. America has been encouraging countries to not tell the Chinese Communist Party whether they're passing through the region, and offering military protection as they travel through the region. America is doing what it calls freedom of navigation operations, meaning it's just going through and bringing military ships through these areas in defiance of the Chinese Communist Party, sending a message to the Chinese Communist Party: you do not have the right to police this region, you do not have the right to deny other countries access to this region, and no, nobody has to ask you permission to sail through this area. China is, of course, continuing its actions to claim ownership over those regions. That strategy, the big concern is that the CCP will replicate that strategy in other areas. Maybe it will build artificial islands in the Horn of Africa. Maybe it'll build artificial islands at both ends of the Panama Canal, and then claim to have territorial control over the surrounding waters, just like it's doing, for example, in South China Sea. Where it has worked in one area, it might work somewhere else if we allow it to work. And so part of the strategy America has been, deploying is this, of course, freedom of navigation operation, and also talking about, the ability of us to secure our supply chains, to make sure that these channels are not closed off. As soon as we stop those operations, we can watch very rapidly new powers take place where the CCP does begin saying, hey, this is our territory now. You have to pay the toll or you can't come through, or just telling countries they can't go through. If that happens, you're going to watch entire countries get cut off from the global economy. And China could argue, hey, well, America sanctions countries for violating international norms. We decide what the international norms are now. And as part of our way of punishing you, we're just going to deny you access to the global economy. That is one of the very real concerns of what that could mean. The standard, the Pax Americana that has been in place for a very long time, could be denied. And as U.S. citizen on the ground is mentioning, that could mean that medications, even food, even basic goods can be denied to certain countries, and certain countries could even be denied access to global trade, meaning the destruction of their economies. You could watch entire countries be turned in, you could watch first world countries get turned into third world countries overnight using these tactics. And there's also a concern, even for the United States, that we depend on China, for example, for rare earth minerals. We depend on China for medication. We depend on China and other countries for key materials to maintain our basic livelihoods, our basic way of life. And if we don't maintain the ability to access international trade, we could easily get cut off at this point. There's a real battle for this taking place. Real quick, before we jump into more questions, I just did a big special feature on the CCP's hidden hand. This is part of my investigation recently in South Korea. You might remember I was filming for South Korea for quite a bit. Let me show you a teaser for that before we continue. And again, for those of you on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Rumble, you can watch that for free on Epoch TV, EpochTV.com. Again, we're making this special feature free for everybody. So even if you're on YouTube, whatever else, you don't have an Epoch TV subscription, you're able to watch this special feature free of charge. The link is on EpochTV.com, EpochTV.com, link in the description as well. Let me show you this trailer. The Chinese Communist Party uses bribery, blackmail, economic threats, and outright subversion to quietly seize control of other nations. While the CCP threatens to invade Taiwan using military force, well, the communist regime is already invading other nations, only it's not being done with troops and bombs. Instead, it's being done with non-military tactics. And South Korea has been an active target of the Chinese Communist Party in this lesser-known form of war. All right, well, real quick, those of you on YouTube, every Tuesday and Thursday, I'll be doing the full episodes on, all the different channels, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Rumble. So you can watch the full episodes of Crossroads on those days, but for the other 3 days a week, we're going to just be doing the first part of the show, and then, of course, the Q&A and the rest only on Epoch TV, EpochTV.com. And we also have our special features, documentaries, and a lot of other great content only on Epoch TV. Big update as well. We now have part 2 of our January 6th documentary coming out. The release for that is going to be on January 6th, only on Epoch TV. The real story of January 6th, part 2, is going to be coming out very soon, so stay tuned for that. And I believe that we had a pretty big impact with the first one, so yeah, we'll see what the impact on this one is. All right, let's jump into some more questions. Cassie Hansen, you're saying, Josh, I thought China's economy was crashing and the outlook for Xi Jinping was dire. Is this still the case? Yes, it is. Actually, Xi Jinping himself noted this recently. If Xi Jinping is saying the economy's bad, that means it's really bad. Again, the perception of China doing well is what the CCP often uses to lure in, business opportunities and foreign investment. If they're acknowledging that their economy is doing poorly and that, it's not an ideal time to come into China, that means things are pretty dang bad. And remember, though, that a country doing poorly economically does not necessarily mean that war is averted. Actually, in some cases, that could actually mean a greater threat of war. Because when countries are not doing so well, that's when they start looking for outside solutions. And if they start looking for outside solutions, one of those solutions could be, stealing it from another country. Historically in the world, you've seen nations invade other countries, invade neighboring countries in order to steal assets. When it comes to the Chinese Communist Party, the very real, I think, first tier possibility of this is that it will invade and take over Taiwan. TSMC, the Taiwanese, telecommunications company there, semiconductor company, TSMC, the company that produces some of the best semiconductors in the world and technology, by the way, which China, under the Chinese Communist Party, is not able to get. That company is becoming one of the, let's say, big jewels that China might try to seize. Because of sanctions right now, the Chinese Communist Party is cut off from the high-tech economy. And one of the agendas of the Chinese Communist Party was to get out of cheap manufacturing. China has been stuck as the cheap manufacturer of the world, the factory of the world. They don't like being in that situation. They had a strategy, which was China 2025. They had another one called Project 863. And this was looking to next generation technologies. They wanted to make China in the position similar to the United States, where they ironically steal all of our innovation, replicate it in China, and they become the innovators of the world. They become the ones developing all the next generation technology because they steal all the designs and so on from all the innovators of the world. And because China would then become, the high-tech hub of the world, other countries could become the cheap manufacturers, the ones who do all the legwork and so on. Why would they want to pay, premiums to other countries, for example, to have their factories in China when China could have it all? That was the big plan. The Achilles heel of that plan was semiconductors, these high-tech chips. You're not going to be able to build high-tech phones like smartphones and so on unless you have the current generation chips. If you're going to be even 5 years behind or 10 years behind or 20 years behind, that's a big generational gap when it comes to smartphones. Think of the difference of 10 years in terms of the iPhone. Where was the iPhone 10 years ago? That is essentially where you would be if you were 10 years behind. And when it comes to generations in chips and generations in some of these core technologies, that's where the game is. When it comes to computers, when it comes to AI, when it comes to all of that, think of the difference of 5-10 years. China under the Chinese Communist Party is debatably even further behind than that on domestic technology. And so being cut off from these advanced chips puts them back very far. Taiwan, interestingly, and South Korea, interestingly, are two of the countries that have these capabilities of developing these high-tech chips. I've been talking a lot about South Korea, how the CCP is trying to gain control of the country using mainly subversion and political warfare. And of course, gaining a foothold in South Korea using those unconventional war methods. Taiwan is a little more difficult for the Chinese Communist Party because they know the game. And Taiwan has already outlawed a lot of the unconventional tactics of the CCP, other than, for example, direct political warfare and crime. And because of that, when the CCP is talking about taking over Taiwan, unconventional means are a little more difficult. Unless, for example, with the upcoming Taiwanese election, you have the pro-CCP party take over, which, again, it's the KMT, the Kuomintang. They might have a shot at it. And so it's possible the CCP could conquer Taiwan by means of election interference. Anything short of that, they're talking about actual war. And again, if China takes over Taiwan, the CCP takes over Taiwan, you could have these very valuable TSMC factories able to manufacture these next generation chips fall into the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. That is very real right now. And again, given, as Cassie Hansen was noting, given the very rough situation of the Chinese economy, that could be seen as the Hail Mary, the last attempt to save the CCP's economy. It is possible they might do it. Paul Novante, you're saying, isn't the U.S. now politically, internationally impotent? Relatively speaking, yes, unfortunately. The Biden administration is not playing with a full deck of cards, I'd say. And that being said, though, keep in mind the broader context of this. A lot of the world is actually very far left. Most of Europe is very, very far left. Most of the Asian regions, a lot of them are, at the very least, socialist countries, if not communist countries. A lot of Latin America and Africa are either socialist or communist. The United States and I'd say, global populist movement is one of the few remaining, I'd say, truly conservative countries on the face of the planet. And again, the resurgence of, let's say, a Donald Trump or a Trump-like figure is an anomaly in the world right now. Although you do have this kind of undercurrent shifting things globally. My point with saying this is that, Biden's administration and the, green policies he has, that's the policies for a lot of Europe. That's the policies for a lot of the world. And so even though, Biden, in terms of the economy, in terms of, let's say, his ability to do most things is not quite up to par for most America's standards, it is in line with a lot of the global politics, unfortunately. I'd say, in my opinion, right, unfortunately. I do think you have a lot of very far left governments in the world. And so it's not out of tune with them per se. That being said, of course, the other real situation we're facing is that a lot of them are coming to understand that America having a strong leader is good for the world, because America having a strong leader means we actually do something when, let's say, Russia threatens to use nuclear weapons, when Iran reaches this state where it can create a nuclear weapon within 2 weeks, where North Korea is threatening global war again, and it's putting military satellites in place, where Argentina is threatening to conquer, the country just to the north, not Argentina. Venezuela is threatening to conquer the country just to the north of it. When countries threaten global war and are just acting like there's no rules in the world, normally our allies look to the United States to protect them. And, normally in order for that to happen, you'd have to have a strong leader in place to be willing to do that. Criticize America as they will for playing that role, every country on earth, every free nation actually depends on us to play that role. You know what I mean? They criticize us for doing it, but they want us to do it. And, I would say that unfortunately Biden is not showing the strength, I think, to deter these types of threats currently. And a lot of these things are being allowed to take place. Given that situation, I would say that it is the case that America is politically and internationally impotent, as Paul Navante has said. And I would say that maybe because of that, a lot of the world is realizing that, hey, you know what? They might disagree with the idea that the American conservatives like to own guns and believe in defending the world against international terrorism and tyrants. But you know what? Criticize us as they may, they all want us to do it. You know what I mean? So one of the ironies of it. And I would say that as the world becomes less secure and less safe, a lot of these countries are starting to realize that they might need to play those roles themselves. And reality is knocking at their door, and they haven't had to face that reality in a very long time. We're at an interesting place in the world right now. All right, folks, that said, it's getting late in the day. We have the full episodes, again, on YouTube, Tuesdays and Thursdays. So if you're on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Rumble, so on, every Tuesday and Thursday, we're airing our full episodes. There's a lot of stuff I cannot show you because YouTube will censor us. And so a lot of the, let's say, more sensitive content, i.e. the more important things in the world, I will keep those on the days we're not going to be doing the full episodes on YouTube, usually Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and that'll be after the jump over to Epoch TV exclusively. All the banned content, all the real stories of the things we cannot talk about on, unfortunately, the censored platforms. Those will be exclusively on Epoch TV, EpochTV.com. All right, folks, that said, also, speaking of banned content, we'll also have our documentaries, like the second part of the Real Story January 6th Part 2, which will be airing very soon on January 6th. That is going to be exclusively on Epoch TV, EpochTV.com. Briefly as well, during this time period, we're also making the first January 6th documentary we did. Again, the Real Story January 6th, free to watch. So if you haven't seen it yet, be sure to head over at Epoch TV and check it out. All right, folks, that said, thank you all for being here. I'm sorry I was gone for so long. I was not feeling well, but glad to be back with all of you. And as always, that said, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.